Um, I've tried to cross borders by land a few times in my life, and international borders, and every time I do, it's always like the worst experience of my life. And but it's like one of those things that I keep thinking it's going to be okay this time, and I'm like, oh, I'll like go on some trip and like, okay, we'll take a bus to wherever, and then we'll just cross the border by land. It's going to be totally fine, and it always ends up being totally miserable. And it's like a problem that I think I have in my life, where I like keep doing things that I already know are going to be miserable, and which explains why I went on all of the scout camps I went on as a teenager. It also explains why I went on like multiple dates with this person I dated for like 6 months once. And I'm miserable every time, and I just kept going. And so a few years ago, I went on this trip with my uncle and my sister and my grandma, and my 80-year-old grandma. And we decided, we like found these tickets to the Middle East that were pretty inexpensive, and we're like, oh my gosh, let's go. And we don't know anything about the Middle East and have no business being there at all. And we're not the kinds of people that know things. But the tickets were inexpensive, and that's why we wanted to go. And we're also not the kind of people that make plans because we're lazy. And so we didn't make any plans for this trip at all. And we were too cheap, and so we didn't like get like a guide or anything like that. It was like just like setting up for disaster, basically. And we went to Egypt. We got to Egypt, and we just figured we'd figure it out when we got there. You know? We like spent some time in Egypt, and it was like mostly a disaster. And we're all like dehydrated and like had a heat stroke and diarrhea and whatever else. But we weren't talking about it because gross. And my grandma, my poor 80-year-old grandma was getting like dragged through the desert. I'm trying to fix lately. I always thought the past tense to drag was drug. We were dragging her through the desert, and we decided we wanted to make it to go east to Israel, to the Holy Land, and so we were like having our last day in Egypt, and we decided to spend the day shopping for a bunch of really tacky souvenirs that we later found out were really hard to get home because we bought like 47 alabaster pots that didn't fit into our bags. I exaggerate a lot, but we actually bought 47 alabaster pots. And we're like, sure, we could just carry these onto the plane. And they were like big. So we were in like this souvenir shop, and my grandma was like started flipping through this papyrus calendar. It was like something really tacky and cheap looking, and my grandma, just like a couple of words about my grandma, she's the sweetest, like kindest human being who's ever lived, probably the purest person who roams the earth right now. And she's 80 years old, and she's just like so wise and wonderful and kind, and she has like this very sweet voice. And like on the great and terrible day of the coming of the Lord, I'm going to like surgically attach myself to her and be like, wherever she goes, I go too. and we love her to death. I mean, in our family, we call her the White Wizard, which I don't know if that's a Lord of the Rings thing. I never sat through those movies because boring. But so at the beginning of this trip, though, my uncle had bought my grandma a book at the airport to like keep her occupied, and it was a biography about Queen Noor, who was this American woman who married the King of Jordan and became the Queen of Jordan. And my grandma like thought that we would all be really interested in hearing every fact about this book that she was reading. So like for every 5 minutes for days and days, she would like interject into any conversation. Well, let me just tell you one more thing about that Queen Noor. I don't care. But it was really interesting to kind of watch the evolution of her opinion on Queen Noor over the course of several days, because it like started and at the beginning of the trip, it was like, let me tell you one more thing about that Queen Noor. She was a wonderful woman who did many great things. And then it was like a couple of days later, it was, let me tell you one more thing about that Queen Noor. She wasn't perfect, and nobody is. And then a couple of days later, it was, well, that Queen Noor did some bad things, but I don't blame her. Being married to that man she was married, I would do some bad things too. And then like eventually it had like degraded down to, that Queen Nor was a tramp, and I don't want anybody in this family reading that book. Where's the trash? I don't know what this says about us, but the trampier Queen Nor got, the more interested we were in that book. So we were in his souvenir shop. My grandma starts flipping through this papyrus calendar and like telling us some fact about Queen Nor's bra size. And we're like, and the shop owner came over and he's like, this calendar is $80 or some like absurd price nobody would ever pay for this thing. And my grandma hadn't been carrying any money on her. She had no like Egyptian currency. My uncle was just paying for everything for her. And he walked over and he's like, oh, we're not interested in that, thank you. And we walked out of the shop and we walked down the street. And my uncle slipped into a small shop while my sister and grandma and I just stayed outside and waited for him. And this shopkeeper, the papyrus calendar shopkeeper, came down the street holding it, and he just handed it over to her and he said, I just want to gift this to you. And it was really, really sweet. And this kind of happens to my grandma everywhere she goes because she's like the white wizard and everybody can sense that. And like I actually think she should make it her full-time job to just go around to events and collect swag. She would probably like totally squander the opportunity on like picking up things for like crocheting and like old church books and genealogy or something. And so he hands her this calendar and we're like, wow, that was really nice. And the shopkeeper starts walking away and my grandma looks at my sister and I like deadpan face and she says, you didn't see anything, and she slips it into her purse. And we're like, what? Senility, you know. But I was like, okay, well maybe she wants us to keep this a secret from our uncle, so maybe she wants to give him like this gift, and she wants it to be a surprise. And I was like, it's going to be a really disappointing surprise, but whatever, let her have it. At that age, you let him have it. And so we went throughout the rest of the day. We didn't tell our uncle anything. And that night we got to the hotel room and we were like packing up our things because we were going to make our journey to Israel the next day. And Grandma pulled out her purse and she started pulling things out of her purse, and she pulls out this papyrus calendar and throws it onto a bed. And my uncle looked over at it and he's like, Mom, we didn't buy that. I thought we rejected that purchase. And my grandma, in like Academy Award winning performance, puts her hands to her face and just says, oh dear. I was so mad when that man said it was $80, and then I had a diabetic attack and I just swiped it. And my sister and I, like, we knew the truth, but it was like so convincing that we were like, Grandma! You're not supposed to steal! And my uncle was like shocked, and like his mother was like had totally deteriorated, and he's just found out that this like person that he always thought was perfect his whole life was actually like a kleptomaniac. And I just like still remember him like saying, Mom, they cut your hand off for that. And I was like, really? And he's like, well, I don't know, probably. Because we're not the kind of people who know things. So the next morning we got up and we had like figured out that probably the cheapest way to get to Israel was to fly from Egypt over to Jordan and then cross the border by land. And so that's what we were going to do. We're like, oh, that sounds easy. We cross state borders all the time. What's the difference? So made it into Jordan. It was like a big hassle, and then we like found like a taxi. And we're like, can you take us to the border? And so the guy drives there is like this. We hit military checkpoints like every step of the way, and like get frisked and rubbed up and down by all kinds of strangers, and which was nice. And we finally got to the border, and when we got there, we found out that the border was like closed. That border was closed that day, that crossing area. And somebody at the border was like, well, the only one that's open that they can get across is up in the northern part of the country by the border of Syria. And we were like, heard the word Syria, we're like, all of us were like, well, we don't know what Syria is, but it's been on TV and it's never good news. So we're like, sure. So we start driving. Make it up the border, and it's like really hot, and we're all getting like very tired and like more and more dehydrated by the moment. We finally get up to the border crossing up near Syria, and we get up there and we start what ended up being this really miserable process of buying. We had to like buy a bus ticket that would take. We get on a bus that would like take us 40 feet, then we get off and get frisked. And then buy another bus ticket that would take us 40 feet, and then get off and get frisked. And like this like happened for like 4 hours. And we were getting like really good at getting frisked. And like so good at it. Wish I could make it my full-time job. A lot more fun than my real one. And so this went on for a while, and then we were on one of the 40-foot bus drives. And a military man came onto the bus and he had like this big machine gun, and we were the only like obnoxious American tourists on the bus. Everybody else was like, they were supposed to be there, we weren't. And he got onto the bus and we were sitting at the back, and he started walking towards the back of the bus and looking at everybody's passports as he's going. And we was like really nervous the whole day because we didn't know what we were doing, and like, okay, you know, what if something happens? What if one of us gets into trouble? And my uncle was like, okay, you guys, if anybody gets like pulled out of the bus or pulled aside, like we all go together, we stay together. And we like thought this sounded like a pretty responsible plan, and like we were a forever family, and so we're like, okay. So he's like walking to the back of the bus, and he gets closer and closer to us, and we're getting more and more nervous, and then he grabs my grandma's passport and he starts flipping through it, and he like grows visibly angry as he's flipping through this passport. He clutches it in his hand, sticks it into his pocket, and immediately all three of us are like, she's not with us! She steals! But then he took my sister's passport and did the same and stuck that in his pocket, and took all four of us. He took all of our passports, and then he marched off of the bus angrily. And we're like, we need those back. Like maybe he misinterpreted when we handed them over that we were gifting them to him. And then as he got off of the bus, he like yelled something at the bus driver, and then the bus like turned around. And we're like, oh no. And all of the people were like looking back at us on the bus, like angrily looking back at us, because they're like, why are we going backwards? Like, we've been doing this for 4 hours, we're just trying to get across the border. And so we go back to the last place that we had been, and the man comes back onto the bus and starts screaming at us. But he's like not screaming at us in like a language we know, so we don't know what he's saying. We just like assume he's complimenting us. Like, thanks. I don't know where I got it. So I don't know what it is. But so he's like, get off the bus, like, but we think that's what he's saying, but he's like gesturing. So we followed him off of the bus, and he takes us into this building, and the bus is just sitting there. All of our stuff is still on the bus, so the bus can't leave without us. Well, I guess it could, but they were being nice. They didn't. And he takes us into this building and puts us into this little room, and this man comes in very broken English, just starts like screaming at us. And something about documents and exit visas, and we didn't have the right this or that, and then they handed us back our passports, and my sister opened her passport, and there was this big stamp in it that said in English, immediately take to the nearest police. And she's like, and we're all like, oh, too bad for you. And she's like, well, check yours. And we all look, and we're like, all of us had it. All of our passports had the same stamp. And we're like, no! Because when it was just her, like, well, I have two other sisters. And so the man's like screaming at us in this room, and we're like, oh my gosh, like we don't know we're sorry, we didn't know that we needed like special documents. We thought that like you would just let us go through. And this is going on. It was like an interrogation, like in these interrogation rooms, and he keeps coming and going. It's like really intense, and we're like nervous, and we're like, are we gonna be on locked up abroad? Because I didn't bring any of my personal items. This just keeps going, and it's like getting worse and worse, and like we're all kind of panicking a little bit naturally, and just really nervous about this. And then finally he comes in, and we're like trying to explain, like what do you need us to do, because you're not offering a solution, you're just yelling at us. But like there was no reasoning. And finally he said, well, if you pay us some amount of money, like name some amount of money, then we'll give you the documents that you need and you can go on your way. Well, we didn't have any money, probably because we wasted it on ice cream. But we didn't have money. And so we're like, well, we don't have that, but like, is there another option? And he yelled at us. It was like booming voice. This huge man yelled at us, "This is not a free country." And we're like, we know. We're aware. And my grandma finally speaks. It's like silent for a moment, and then grandma speaks, and she says, "Oh, I know. I've been reading this book about Queen Noor. Wasn't she just the most remarkable woman?" And this man like stares at her, and we're like, "Grandma, now's not the time. Nobody cares about Queen Noor." And this man just like looks at her, and he looks her over, and then he just takes our passports and stamps them. He's like, "Just go." And Grandma like marches briskly back to the bus. I'm like, why didn't you just put me in charge in the first place? We got back onto the bus, and the people on the bus were so angry with us that they wouldn't let us walk back to our seats. Like they physically blocked us, and like people were like yelling curses at us, and we're like, sorry. There's probably something really good on TV that night that everybody was missing. So we had to stand at the front of the bus, like just at the front while it drove, and like like facing all of the people. We're like, this is not one of those stories where all the strangers become your friends, or where you like date them and then they become strangers again. I think that's what happened, So finally, the bus got to like the Israel building where like all of the frisking started over, but now it was Israel doing it instead of Jordan, and it was just the same. Frisking is the same in every country. It's a universal language. And so the frisking like started over, and now we're like getting more and more interrogation. I'm like, why are you here? What are you? And like somebody had asked us like, why do you want to go to Israel? And we're like, because of the Bible, or the Quran, both. I don't know. Which one do you accept? And then more frisking, and then more questions, more frisking, and we finally get to the final woman, and she's like standing there with a clipboard, and somehow we sensed that this was the last one because she seemed really in charge, and she was like, "What are you doing here? Why are you here? Who are these people that you're traveling with? What are you carrying? Why do you want to go to Israel?" And we're like, "We just want to see where Jesus lived." And so we like answered all of her questions, and then all of a sudden she like turned into like an employee at an exotic resort, and she's like, "Welcome to Israel." And now it had been like 14 hours since we started this process. And it was like 1 o'clock in the morning, and we like walked outside, and we're like, we're free. But then we were in the middle of nowhere and had no way, like we didn't even know where we were supposed to go. And so we like walked down this road and found this man sitting on top of a taxi, and he was smoking something out of a pipe. And we're like, "Will you take us to Jerusalem?" And we think he did. Unless that wasn't Jerusalem. We are not the kind of people who know things. We spent several days in Israel, and then when it was time to leave, we had to like undo the whole process, but we're like, we cannot cross by land again. Like we didn't have it in us to go through that experience again. And so we found like some really cheap plane tickets from Tel Aviv to Amman, Jordan, and we're like, oh, we'll just fly over the border and then you skip the whole thing. And like none of us had like looked it up on a map to see how far those two cities were apart, but like we were kind of expecting it to be like an hour or two flight. We get on the plane and the pilot comes on and he's like, good morning, welcome to Jordanian Air or whatever it was. Flight time today, 17 minutes. And we're like, did he say 70? Like, no, because he would have said an hour and 10 minutes. It couldn't be 17, because it was like this huge plane, too. Like, it couldn't be 17. So the plane takes off, and like, as the plane is like leaving the runway, the woman is like already giving us like drinks, and standing there and like, hurry, hurry, hurry. Like, tipping the cup so they'll like drink faster, and then she like puts it in her thing and like straps herself back down, and the plane lands. I think we like cleared a fence. That was it. And I was like, this flight exists so that you don't have to cross the border by land. Like, that's it. That's the whole purpose. We made it in Jordan. We had to go back to Israel. It was like all these like series of flights. We're just trying to get back to the United States of God bless America. And we finally got onto this flight out of Egypt to go to Amsterdam, and I'm sitting next to my grandma, and we were so, like, everybody was so tired, and grandma kept complaining about like her diabetes and her insulin, and we're like, doesn't always have to be about you, grandma. The world revolves around her. Most selfish 80-year-old woman I've ever met. I was sitting next to my grandma on this flight, and I started feeling really nauseous. And anybody who's ever heard my stories before is probably thinking, oh no, he threw up all over the plane. I didn't this time. It's the only flight where I haven't thrown up all over the plane. But I started feeling really nauseous, and I was like, Grandma, I feel so nauseous, what should I do? And my grandma was like, well, get up and walk around. And that's what Queen Noor would do. So I got up and I started walking like up and down the aisle, and I got up to like the front of the plane, and all of a sudden I felt lightheaded, really, really lightheaded. Increasingly, I lost consciousness, and I fell flat on my face. And I don't remember that part because I was unconscious, but apparently it was terrible. And when I came to, I was like shaking and like having some kind of like shivering a lot, and and I wasn't wearing shoes, I don't know why, and there was a man who was sitting in the seat, this passenger, who was holding my bare feet in his lap, and he looked horrified because my feet are disgusting. I have like a lot of foot diseases. But he's like holding my feet in his lap, and I'm laying on my back on the floor, and there are like all these people around me, and they're like, you're gonna die. And they're like wrapping these like those paper thin blankets on me, and which I took some, I still have them, and finally they like kind of put me back in my seat, and I was feeling really sick, and I'm like hunched over with all these blankets on me, and I'm shivering, feeling really sick, and I started talking to my grandma, and we were talking about the trip that we had, and I like went on this little thing where I started telling her just about how interesting it is that we can go to all these places in the world and see all of these people that we've never seen before and that we would never see. And it's really fascinating when you think about it that all of the experiences in our lives that are worth telling are typically enhanced or at least affected by the people that we encounter along the way, the strangers that we encounter along the way. And a stranger is two things. It's an unknown and it's a person. And I think that usually when we use a stranger, at least more often than we should, we use that word with kind of this, in the spirit of emphasizing the unknown part and ignoring the person part. And it's kind of a shame because I think our stories are a lot more meaningful if we can view them and with the spirit of emphasizing both of those parts, the unknown and the person part. Because the unknown is what makes a stranger exciting and surprising and scary, but the person part is what makes all of those things matter. And I was talking to my grandma about this, and we were talking about kind of all the people that we had sort of encountered along the way, and I talked about how, you know, we had seen this shopkeeper who saw goodness and then acted like in a kind manner, and how we had encountered those Border Patrol people who didn't want to let us go through until my grandma mentioned the name Queen Noor. And the flight attendant who comically tried to like force feed us beverages on a 17-minute flight. And this man, who I still don't know his name, who held my athlete's foot in his bare hands. And it was beautiful, and we were on this plane, and it was really beautiful, and I was like thinking about this and how all these little people like stepped into our lives very momentarily, but they all affected us in ways that we're going to talk about for the rest of their lives, and I'm even talking about it now. And we all have the ability to have those even small effects on each other as strangers. And I said this to my grandma, and I looked at her, and she was kind of like in silent contemplation, nodding and sort of taking in what I had said, and I wanted to hear her thoughts on it. And after a moment of thinking, she finally said, "Eli, I didn't think I had taken my insulin, so I gave myself a shot, but I just remembered I had taken my insulin." That was the last time we ever saw Grandma. I lied. Thank you.